Okay, welcome everyone to Hopkins at Home. Thank you for joining us for the second session of this series. We have a really interesting program tonight that I'll be previewing in a moment, but I first want to introduce myself and also have our speakers briefly introduce themselves. My name is Karen Alexander, and I work in the International Arts and Mind Lab at the Johns Hopkins University Brain Science Institute, and I manage our outreach and education efforts. And our lab, as those of you who joined us last week will know, is focused on looking at the intersections between neuroscience, art, architecture, and aesthetics. And I'd like my colleague, Dr. Tasha Golden, to introduce herself next, followed by Dr. Shante Stocks.
Hi, all. Thanks so much for being here tonight. My name is Tasha Golden, and I am a senior arts and health research scientist in the Arts and Mind Lab and direct research there. And but my first career was as a singer-songwriter, an artist, and musician, and poet. So I'm glad to combine those things together in our discussion this evening. And I'll pass it over to Dr. Stocks.
Hi, I'm Dr. Shante Stocks. I am the Assistant Director of Fellowships and Community Engagement with Inheritance Baltimore, a new project with Johns Hopkins University through the Center for Africana Studies. And I am also a poet, so that is awesome. And I love being able to bring together literature, poetry, and music as well, although I do not sing, but I appreciate the lyrics.
Great, thank you. So last week, we learned about some of the ways that engaging in literary arts can help improve health and well-being. We also heard about the history and progress of the One Book Baltimore project, which is a collaborative effort of the Enoch Pratt Free Library, Baltimore City Public Schools, the Rowe Price Foundation, and the International Arts and Mind Lab. We reviewed data from the second year evaluation of that 5-year project and also discussed how middle schoolers have been impacted by the program, in which 7th and 8th graders across the city read a single text and then have opportunities to discuss it either in class or in community-based events. So tonight we are going to be looking at the book itself, the 2021 book, We Speak for Ourselves by Baltimore author G. Watkin, and we'll be discussing themes from a few of the essays in that book. And we will also be engaging in a brief creative writing exercise led by Dr. Golden. But first, Dr. Stocks has very graciously agreed to reflect upon her own experiences with the power of reading and writing, and also the importance of diverse perspectives in the literary arts. So I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, thank you. And I've been given this so much thought in terms of thinking about how would I like to start? Because when you look back, you think about when was the first time I fell in love with words? Or when did I fall in love with literature? And I can not remember a moment when I did not love reading. Well, that's not true. There are some books I was forced to read in middle school and high school that I didn't necessarily love. So, but just in terms of reading for my own edification, reading for the passion of it, the words of it, because words are so powerful and meaningful, and words construct reality. And so I always tell people, be careful of what you say and how you phrase it, because you're putting something powerful out there in the universe. And you want to make sure that what you're speaking life. And so I always think about that. And I wanted to kind of just start at the beginning. So I'm a Baltimorean, grew up, born and raised in Baltimore. And I lived all over Baltimore from what I can remember. My mom really loved, Baltimore City is a city of neighborhoods. So let's just say I explored a lot of Baltimore City neighborhoods, which was exciting. And as I got older, the social conditions of where I live began to really make me ask a lot of questions like, why is this happening? What's going on with that? And so people always told me, well, go read about it, go look it up. This is before the internet, where you really did have to go to a book, go to the library, although oral history has always been strong as well in our family, but it was more so wanting to seek that knowledge for yourself. So I remember being in middle school and reading books, Black biographies specifically, because I wanted to definitely learn more about Black culture and Black history, because I didn't learn a lot about it in my school setting. Black History Month, but sometimes we were taught the same leaders, the same heroes. And I was like, there's more to us. And I definitely wanted to explore that more. So the beginning of my readings was a lot of like Black biographies, Oprah Winfrey. I remember reading about Louis Armstrong and also poets. I really fell in love with Maya Angelou. It was one of my favorite poets early on. And poems that spoke to me were poems that really spoke life, that talked about, oh, I cannot forget Langston Hughes, sorry, another early on favorite poet of mine as well. Let's just say Harlem Renaissance poets as well, and writer Zora Neale Hurston. I really can go on and on, but writers who wrote about Black life, Black identity, that was so important to me to learn about so that I could see more than just my neighborhood and my community and what Blackness meant in this particular setting, but the expansive nature of Blackness. What does this mean? And so when I went to boarding school, I didn't have any Black teachers. Growing up from K to 8 in Baltimore City, I had mainly Black and white educators, but in middle school, I went to, not middle school, high school, I went to St. Timothy's in Stevenson, Maryland. And that was just such a culture shift for me. It's more of an international boarding school. And so even there, I was like, okay, I was faced with some stereotypical questions and that sort of thing, but even being taken away from a predominantly Black community made me want to learn even more about the expansiveness of our Black culture and identity. And as I was reading about We Speak for Ourselves and my long-term interest in identity, it made me think of just a short passage as we're thinking about connecting for the work that I've been doing for a large portion of my career, which is community-based learning, community engagement. But I always tell people that there is an I in unity, there is an I in community. So there has to be an I which we explore. And so I wrote this very small narrative as I was reading this chapter, the several chapters. There's no I in team, they say, but there is an I in unity. There is an I in identity. You have to know who you are and from whence you came to unify with someone else. When you understand yourself, you can explore community. The I matters to move from I to we. Perspective matters in community. So as I was thinking about just the work that we were reading, that was really standing out to me. So, and I also wanted to share talking about flexibility. So I really kind of accented this talk with also some of the poetry. So thinking about, again, the theme of expansiveness within Black culture. And I was reading one of the chapters and I remember D. Watkins saying that there's not like this just one-dimensional Black person. We don't have this one-dimensional Black identity in which we share. And so I have yet another poem, if you will indulge me. It's called Ever Evolving. I am ever evolving. So when you say how I be, I think free, in flux, in time, I be. For I am ever evolving. I'm not stationary, in constant motion, growing into the seeds I nurture. My ground is wet with moisture, and I feed my need to grow and be freely. My mind races about, my heart beating at opportunity, for I am ever evolving. I see no end to me, growing, but for death. Otherwise, my mind got Google Maps, planning out my next steps. Don't try to keep up. Don't get whiplash. I'll show you who and where I am at the appointed time, because at a different time, I'll be a different me, free. For I am ever evolving. I broke the glass ceiling. I took off the lid. So when you say how I be free. For I am ever evolving. So I'm not hitting my head. I'm reaching for the moon. And if I bring back a couple stars, I'll shoot again. For I am ever evolving. So when I think about that, I think about the different stories that I read. Oh, thank you. I think about the different stories that I read. And again, this expansiveness of who we are in terms of Black culture, Black community, you know, the African diaspora. So we are also ever evolving, because culture is not static, right? Culture is complex and ever evolving, as is language. And so that has been attractive to me since I was younger, being able to think about the social conditions, the social situations that I saw in Baltimore City and wanting to learn and thinking about the writers. I remember anytime I had a question that didn't have the answer right there in front of me, I read a book. Like not growing up with my dad, seeing so many of my younger brothers and cousins, having to go through the penal system. And I was like, wait, is this some sort of, I felt like it was a rites of passage to a certain extent, and it frustrated me so much. So I started reading more Black male authors because it's like, I want to learn about Black male identity. And I need people to tell me about this because I myself can't say, well, this is what it is. And so I remember reading Makes Me Want to Holla. I don't know if any of you have ever read that. I remember reading Invisible Man, which is a piece to get through. But I started reading books and started reading so that it would help answer for me some of the journey of what it means to be a Black male in America. And then wanting to host discussions, because of course, after you read it, you want to talk about it, right? You want to get other perspectives on it. And that's also the power and the dynamic of language. So those were some of my favorites. And before I get off topic, I have to, not off topic, but I made myself a list here. So I want to definitely stick to my list. So after going to boarding school, I then went to undergrad and talk about perspective shift and also in terms of ever evolving, moving from thinking about identity in terms of where we are to systems and understanding that this is on purpose, where I am, how this is, how my community looks. This is on purpose, not learning about myself and not seeing myself reflected in literature. That was also on purpose. And it was so disheartening to really begin to learn that in undergrad, that this was on purpose. You not learning about you not seeing you in literature, right? You not seeing the powerful scholars that existed was on purpose so that there would be that internalized racism. There would be that lack that you would say. When I was younger, I remember asking my aunt, why are we like this? And she looked at me like, what are you talking about? Why are Black people like this? And she's, be careful now. But really in thinking that we were less than somehow, but because not being able to be exposed to the greatness and everything that we were, that I found in reading, in literature, in culture. And then I was like, you know what? I'm going to become a teacher so that I can twist this, right? So that I can turn it on its head, because education is liberation. Education is freedom, right? So being able to teach back to youth, to show them who they are in literature, right? To act it out in class and make it dynamic so that they see themselves, in the literature was so important to me when I became an educator, and also giving them voice and agency in terms of picking out the literature and bringing in home culture into the classroom to be able to say that this is what we're reading at home. This is what we study at home. Let me watch my time. And so having my sixth graders be able to share that with me, and also to be educated by the students which I'm teaching, because they have so much to share and so much knowledge as well. And I was reading some of the poems that were submitted on the website, and I was like, wait, let me, get nervous about what I share, because sometimes being vulnerable and sometimes sharing parts of yourself that you might not necessarily be comfortable with, or even sometimes proud of, can be hard. But seeing the braveness of some of the seventh graders and eighth grade writers that I saw, I was like, awesome. They gave me even more bravery, to share. And then also reading about those experiences and saying, yeah, seen that, been there, but also wanting to share the beauty that is Baltimore as well. And so I've written poems about Baltimore that are also about our beauty, about our diversity, about our cultural diversity in the city, about the artistic diversity in the city, because sometimes people want to have this one-dimensional narrative of not just Baltimore, but of Black people, and it's like, no, again, ever evolving, ever expansive nature of who we are, which we can read about, which we ourselves can write about, because we can own the pen, right? The pen is powerful and dynamic, and we can convey that so that we become the author of our own stories, so that the narratives that we produce, other people can read and then likewise see themselves. So in grad school, I was like, you know what, even more. I decided to major in African-American literature, fell in love, absolute love. Some of my favorite writers, again, of course, Zora Neale Hurston. I think I shifted in grad school, whereas before I focused more on some Black male writers and wanting to learn about the Black male experience, to reading more Patricia Hill Collins, getting into more social political writings, moving from considering myself a feminist to considering myself a womanist, because people used to ask me, why are you centering Blackness? Excuse me? Why are you centering Blackness? Why wouldn't I? What's wrong with wanting to center my own identity? What's wrong with wanting to learn more and as much as I can about myself? Like, what makes you uncomfortable with me learning more about me and then wanting to celebrate that? You know, people were like, but we're all just, oh, be careful. We're all just what, right? You want people to be able to explore, again, that I in community, that I in unity, because perspective matters. But I used to get such pushback from wanting to explore race. And then sometimes I would tell people, well, have you explored your own racial identity? Have you explored yourself in literature? The Oxygen Man, I remember reading The Oxygen Man in grad school, and it taught me a different perspective on whiteness. And so I was so excited. I wanted to talk to people about whiteness. So imagine, what do you think about whiteness? What? No, let's explore it. This is important. Because the more you learn about you and how whiteness operates and how whiteness is normalized and how whiteness creates and has dominated cultural norms, right? The canonical nature of literature built on, right? So we have to explore these things. If we don't talk about it, if we don't explore it, then it's just going to sit there as is and be unchallenged. But why is that a norm? But me wanting to talk about Blackness, why is that somehow troubling? What is it that makes you uncomfortable when I want to celebrate Blackness in writing, in literature? What's uncomfortable about that for you? And just asking people to explore that and to share that, write about it, read about it. So that was important to me in grad school to really do that. I almost did my dissertation actually on the study of whiteness, just because I wanted to learn about it that much more, the power of it. And then I grew to expand it to diversity at large and to focus on making people comfortable with the concept of diversity and not wanting to be colorblind and to understand. I wrote a poem actually called Colorblindness, where I wanted people to understand why it was insulting for you to tell me that you don't see my race and why that wasn't a compliment, and how people were actually manipulating Dr. King's words when they were saying that, because the absence of struggle is not peace, right? True peace is working through the struggle to equity and inclusion, right? That's when it's true peace. But people couldn't see that. And so I built my graduate career around really exploring racial dynamics, not just in literature, not just in curriculum, but also in professions, to see and reading about colorblindness, reading about why people genuinely felt that this was the way to go, reading about the intersection of colorblindness and faith, because people really felt that that was something that their faith told them. But thinking about the intersectionality of it all, right? The intersection of faith and race and social structures. What does this mean? So I began to read writers who also, like if you think about Angela Davis, right? Writers who talk about this work as well and talk about these systems, these isms that we must explore. And I began to write about the systems and the isms, because the more I read, I'm not over time, am I? I'm a narrator.
We're getting there. I think we're
okay. So I'm gonna bring it in. The more I read about systems and isms, the more I wrote about it, and it co-opted my poetry. I was going through, and I just looked at the different things that I've written, and a lot of my poems have turned into social, cultural, political poems. Even a love poem that I wrote about Baltimore turned into an exploration of social identity, wondering about as I moved up in terms of the class ladder? Was I still giving back? Was it a Band-Aid, or was it something that was really true and community oriented? Because sometimes what we do just not in the true essence of relating and having that hyphen between service and learning, between community, right? Making sure that the town gown divide is really brought down and it's equitable in terms of partnerships. So, you know, I made sure in that poem that I love this city, but I want to love this city inclusively and honestly. So it's called Place Love, if you get a chance to check it out.
Thank you so much, my goodness. We really appreciate you sharing all of this perspective with us. And so much of what you described is what we were envisioning for the series, really, for people to reflect on their own experiences, maybe not cradle through career, but that's wonderful too. But just thinking about how the power of literature and the power of both reading and writing has really informed and helped you express so much of what you were learning as you continue to evolve. So thank you so much. And it's a perfect segue because next we're going to hear from Dr. Tasha Golden. She's going to talk a little bit about a creative writing exercise. And Tasha, I would love for you to share briefly your work with Project Uncaged, because I think it connects so much to this idea of voice and youth voice in particular. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Karen. Thank you so much, Dr. Sachs. So lovely to hear poetry this evening, especially on your voice. It's alive with it. And I might have a question for you in just a minute. So I'm going to share my screen with you all to walk through some things and keep me on track. But and you set us up so well with poetry. I did not know that you were going to share some. That's so exciting. Because last week we talked about the overarching goals of One Book program, why it could be healthy and in general good for well-being for young folks to be able to read the same book, talk about topics that may otherwise feel too sensitive or stigmatized or awkward to talk about, but the book gives you an occasion and a way to talk through it. And then also, I believe at least Susan Max-Hammond mentioned that one of the ideals for One Book program is that people also do some creative expression as a result of what they read that allows them to process, to communicate, and to have their voices and their ideas amplified and elevated through something like an event. We talked about closing events or through publication. So I wanted to chat about that just a little bit with you all this evening, and hopefully walk through a bit of a creative writing exercise like Karen mentioned as a way to, you know, we've talked about the value of young people doing this, but sometimes I do a lot of work with young folks, and I find that sometimes as an adult, it's helpful for me to participate in some of the activities that I've been claiming are so good for other folks. And sometimes it's a way for me to distance myself from my own vulnerability. As Dr. Sachs mentioned, like it can be vulnerable to go through a process of revealing oneself to oneself. And so it can be a form of reciprocation sometimes for me to do some of the creative writing process that I lead other folks through. So we are going to embark on that a little bit. But Karen asked me a little bit about Project Uncaged. And so this is a, well, I mentioned that my first career, I toured for a lot of years full-time as a singer-songwriter. It's part of how I wound up in public health as my career now, is that I found that people after shows shared really personal and intimate experiences with me as a result of something that I had sung on stage or a story that I had told on stage. And there were several people who shared with me very difficult experiences such as domestic violence or intimate partner violence, and followed it up by saying that I'm the first person they had ever told. And that happened consistently anywhere in the world, from Nashville, Tennessee to Beijing. Like that's just the story that people had time after time, place after place. And I, you know, if that's true, if I'm the first person they'd ever told about that, that of course means they've never told a spouse or partner, they've never told a doctor or a therapist. And that has implications for what we are able to do for folks when we think about community building and that unity and identity and bringing folks together, but also what we do in our healthcare systems, what we do in our community resources. Why was it that they were able to share something at a music venue with a relative stranger in the context of a song that they had never been able to share otherwise? And that led me to my work now. And when I found Project Uncaged, I founded this program. It's a creative writing program that's trauma-informed, designed for girls that are incarcerated in the US juvenile justice system. And I noticed the same things, as you might imagine. Girls shared very different stories in their songs and in their poems than they had ever shared in screenings or surveys about their lives, and even different than what they shared around a table when we were having a snack and just chatting. So I became really invested in this work as a public health scientist and looking at art as a kind of data and what we exclude from our shared and collective knowledge when we exclude people's need for and capacity to communicate via the arts. So some of the foundational elements of Project Engaged revolve around these kind of 4 bullet points, these foundational ideals that youth deserve better resources. They are themselves the priority source of knowledge about their needs and assets and experiences. We recognize that art is an important means of expression, healing, but also influence. And we recognize that art can reach beyond facts and figures to change the hearts and minds of communities, publics, and politicians. Which is to say that in the work of Project Engaged, it is designed to create some kind of island of safety to the extent that anybody can feel safe in a lockdown facility, and a trauma-informed space where you can maybe interact with other people and communicate, improve group dynamics, reduce stress, develop some coping skills, yes, but also definitely a part of the work is to elevate young folks' voices in the discourses about juvenile justice reform. So if we're going to try to reform juvenile justice, how do we incorporate young folks' voices in that? And not just by me doing a survey of young folks and then codifying that and regurgitating it in some way like in an academic article, but how do we let their own voices actually show up in these discourses? So we publish books of their poems. I have a few of them here, although I don't know how well you'll be able to see them. And we send them usually along with policy briefs to the mayor's office, to city council, to state legislators, to secretaries that are involved in the Department of Justice, and try to let the poems speak for themselves and then say, okay, if you recognize that the writers are saying they need X, Y, and Z, or they've been through ABC, then here are some things that you could do about it based on your role, in trying to make those voices be heard. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of background because it fits a lot of what Dee Watkins is talking about in these few chapters that we read, and also fits a lot of what One Book has been doing, which is one reason why I've been so delighted to work on the One Book project. But the program is based in creative expression because it helps nurture trauma responsiveness and cultural responsiveness. Just like Dr. Sachs was saying, there's a way to access materials that might reflect your own experience, and then that can be a way to feel safer, and just it's more approachable. To your own life becomes approachable, your own identity becomes seeable and visible through somebody else's often. There's also the fact that a lot of times a difficult experience that we've been through can be difficult or impossible to verbalize or chat about in conversation like this. But if you can point to somebody else's story and say, that story that Dee Watkins told, or that poem that Dr. Stocks read, that's my story too, then you get a chance to share what's going on in your life without having to be completely responsible all on your own for coming up with a way to share it. It also gives you a way to own your story. You can deconstruct and revise your received stories. The light of art and creativity is that reminds us that everything is created. So whatever I have received, I can acknowledge what I've received, but then I can acknowledge that I as myself can own this story and decide whether to keep it or revise it moving forward. And creative expression often gives us a way to find and create meaning of the experiences that we've had. And we can't go into the past and change it, but we can change the meaning we've made of it. And that's sometimes something we get to explore in the process of creating. But another thing is that it gives us an opportunity for safe and healthy expression. If you're a young person or an adult and you've never been around somebody who is really good at processing and healthfully sharing their emotional experience, then you probably have no idea how to do it yourself. And you might even think that it's impossible. You might just assume that either somebody is unsafe and off the rails, or they just keep everything inside. If you're not seeing a model of some other way to navigate the human experience, then you're kind of you're set adrift on your own. But the arts gives us this model of other people's stories, this way to access, oh, other people have been through something I've been through. And James Baldwin, I don't have the quote in front of me, so I'm paraphrasing, which is awful because he's such a beautiful writer. But he said, I thought that I was alone in the universe, and then I read. And he has another separate quote where he talked about thinking that these things that he's been through, like, oh, Dostoevsky went through the exact same things, just this ability to connect with somebody outside yourself. And then another value of creative expression is that it gives us a chance to imitate. It gives us a sense of direction. Even for myself as a poet, when I'm faced with a blank page, sometimes I freak out. I don't know where to go with that. But if you have access to another writer or another musician, it gives you can start with imitating what's in front of you, and that can give you a place to begin. And Maya Angelou's "Still I Rise" is a favorite poem to imitate among any of the youth that I've worked with of all genders. Also, it might seem counterintuitive, but creative work is often people experience it as being easier to share in group settings than a same experience, but in conversational format like this. So people find that they can, I've had young people come out to one another, to a whole group of fellow students through a poem, and they never came out otherwise. So there can be things that is possible to share through metaphor or through storytelling or through a character that you might not share otherwise. It's a way to bear witness to one another's experience and to have the experience of somebody bearing witness to yourself, and it creates a sense of connection. And then what I mentioned about influence is that creative writing and creative works in general can lend themselves really intuitively to performance and publication. So if you're thinking about how to elevate young people's voices, if they're creating art, then it becomes a matter of like, well, how do we exhibit this? How do we share this? How do we perform it or publish it? And so it creates an honored space for young folks. And when I'm talking to young writers, often I tell them, publishing your work is kind of like if you walk into a museum and there's a pair of eyeglasses like randomly in the corner on the floor of a room, you might see those and be like, oh, somebody must have lost their glasses. Hope they come back and find them. But if you walk into the same room of a museum and there's a glass case and there's a pair of eyeglasses inside the glass case, you're going to assume that there's something special about those glasses. You're going to walk up and be like, I wonder who these belong to, what's the story? And that's similar to the way that a performance or a publication can work for a young person's words, that maybe they're just saying something in a classroom and nobody's really listening. But if you put their words on a page and there's all this white space around it and somebody leaps through it and they're reading it, it creates an honored space for it, which is so important for any of the groups that we don't hear enough from. And of course, like I mentioned, it can establish influence. There's people who write about books and who attend performances who can then publish stories in the media about it and get the word even further. And it gives people that experience of being heard and seen for something valuable that D. Watkins talked about, sharing his work and then having students be like, oh my God, it never occurred to me that I could write something and people would read it and it could change the world. I want to try that. That experience of realizing that you can be seen and heard and valued is so important. And then this last piece of this assets-based way, when I share books of girls' poems, there's a whole bunch of really difficult stories and experiences written about here. But the important thing is that it's impossible to read about these traumatic stories without simultaneously recognizing the person who experienced it as powerful, profoundly creative, as somebody who's actively communicating with her peers or her community. And I always say as a researcher, if there's another way to hear about the difficult needs of a community while simultaneously recognizing their profound assets, I don't know what it is. I'm sure there is some other way, but the arts appears to be unique in that sense. And I think it's important to recognize that as decision makers or leaders or researchers, important to recognize what that gives us. So I will share these slides with y'all later, because what we are hoping is that you will, between now and next week, write something of your own and share it back with us, so we can drop the link to do that sharing into the chat. But I'm going to give you a few things that you can imitate. Speaking of imitations, I just mentioned that. And so just to run quickly through them, you won't get to read them all because they're going to flash on your screen, but you will get, I will send this to you, make sure you have these. But a few of the favorite poems that young folks always love to imitate: "Don't call me sir, call me strong." And just starting with that first line, "It's time to talk back. Hey, don't call me whatever, you get to choose." And then you just have a litany of "call me something else," and that imperative tense, that strong confidence. You can't imitate this without taking up some of that confidence yourself, which is lovely. And "Still I Rise," obvious choice. These are just excerpts of these two songs. I'm sorry, these two poems. And then "Where I'm From," which is a really popular one for young folks to imitate. And of course, we saw Kyan's imitation of that poem in the Charm Lit magazine if you checked out those poems. So you could imitate their poem instead of the original one if you would like to. And then I just included a couple poems from Project Uncaged books. This middle one was about we looked at a whole bunch of pictures of landscapes, and then they could pick which one they felt represented their lives. And you could do the same thing. What represents your life right now or your life as a whole? You can put the word landscape into Google Images and just see what comes up and see what resonates with you and write about it. And this is TLB's poem about my heart, if you wanted to write just line after line about what your heart is or does. So those are just some examples. But just to take a couple minutes, we have just a couple minutes, right, Karen? Okay. So here's one of the quickest prompts that I use all the time and one of everybody's favorites. It's just really easy to write to, and you can let it be whatever you want it to be. But if you're willing to give us a couple minutes of your creative time, we'd love to the goal is for 2 minutes from now, maybe 4 or 5 lines exist in your universe on a piece of paper on a document that don't exist right now. That's the only goal. No grades. You don't have to share it if you don't want to. But this is taken from David Class' book. And here it is. You don't know me at all. You don't know the first thing about me. You don't know where I'm writing this from. You don't know what I look like. You have no power over me. What do you think I look like? Skinny, freckles, wire-rimmed glasses over brown eyes? No, I don't think so. Better look again, deeper. It's like a kaleidoscope, isn't it? 1 minute I'm short, the next minute tall, 1 minute I'm peaky, 1 minute studly. My shape constantly changes, and the only thing that stays constant is my brown eyes watching you. What I like about this is that this character in this book is, he sounds kind of like confrontational, but he's also just telling the truth. That's truth. We don't know him. We don't know this person yet on the first page of the book. So, but he also gives us this setup for this prompt. And here it is. At the top of your document or piece of paper, you just write, "You don't know me," like a title. And in the first line is, "You don't know that." And what is something that you don't know? The you can be anybody. It can be society. It could be a particular person in your life. It could be the rest of us in this class, whatever you want. And then you're just trying to do that 2 or 3 more times. You don't know that what? You don't know what? And then you can write a closing line if you want to, but you don't have to. But you have at least a minute to see what comes up. Just a line or two for you, at least.
So we are going to pivot to a discussion of themes from We Speak for Ourselves. We have a small group here, so I really want to leave it up to all of you. I have questions that I can pose about the 3 chapters that we suggested reading, which was chapter 2, Just Pass the Mic, chapter 13, Be the Person You Needed Growing Up, and chapter 14, There Are No Shortcuts to Change. But I would really love if people feel comfortable either using audio and video or in the chat, letting us know first what kind of stood out to you if you had a chance to read any of those essays, or if not, if you'd like me to go the more traditional route, I'd be happy to share some of the prompts that I came up with for discussion. So I'm going to pause for a moment and see if anyone comes forward, and if not, I will start with my own questions for the group. Great, I will start with my own questions. So one of the, I'm going to talk about chapter 13, Be the Person You Needed When Growing Up. Because in there, Dee reflects a lot about people showing up after the party, right? And he's talking in the context of, for example, if someone from the Black community is murdered, afterwards there might be an initial kind of public outspoken support for the issues that are affecting those neighborhoods, or some kind of folks on the media really elevating the issue for a day or two, but then it quickly dies down again. And his criticism is that, where were you beforehand? Where were you in these situations that led to these incidents happening? And why are they happening time and time again? And he talks about how his experiences with reading and with literacy and illiteracy in his community also really affected how he sees people's abilities to contribute. And he seems to call out folks who on paper seem to be successful, may have attended universities that are considered prestigious, may have jobs that are considered prestigious, and yet they seem to, in his perspective, incapable of knowing how to contribute without being directly told how to do so. And he even talks about his own experiences with his books not being included in curriculum in public schools, even after he hears time and time again from young people the kind of information we heard earlier tonight of how reading something that really spoke to them, especially if they're from Baltimore or a city like it, where they have the kind of experiences that he had growing up in his neighborhood, and his frustrations with having to kind of struggle to help schools or teachers understand that, yes, the topics I cover are challenging, but these children's lives are challenging as well. And it is naive of us to think that if we don't talk about these issues, they don't exist. So I found a lot of that really compelling because when I first read the book, it was through my work actually at our lab. We did a little book club with it. And knowing that 7th and 8th graders were reading this book during this school year, it did give me pause. And I think that speaks a lot to the perspective I'm coming from, which is one of the ones that he would likely criticize. I have a child who's now in 9th grade, and thinking about the kinds of conversations that young people are hopefully having around these essays, it helped me think more about why wouldn't we want this in our schools, and feeling thankful that Baltimore City, that the Enoch Pratt, that the local partners have really come together. And this is the 3rd year of a 5-year program to bring these books that are both deeply relevant, but also deeply challenging to classrooms, and that there are educators like the ones we'll meet next week who have developed curricula to help discuss these issues and to help young people identify their own struggles and challenges, and as Tasha and Shantae both spoke to, find their own ways to creatively express their feelings. It looks like Shantae has would you be willing to say that one out loud?
Sure. One of the, working in community and connecting our students with community, one of the things that students also ask is, how can I, if I don't know anything about Baltimore, I'm from a different place, how can I make a difference? And so I love how Hopkins talked about skill sharing and literally just being who you are and using your sense of self, your personality, your agency, or if you're good at science or math or whatever it is, but using the skill that you have to work with and serve with another person. And so the skill sharing is something as simple as that we share with students, but even for us to think about ourselves, because sometimes these systems are so overwhelming, and it really is like, where do we start? But really starting with who we are and then using who we are to reach out and connect with someone else.
Thank you for that. And I wanted to mention that I think Dee really practices what he preaches, because over the past year, he has done a number of these kind of events with the students who were reading his book. In a non-COVID year, these events would have been happening at library branches, but he spent a good deal of time engaging with individual classes or groups of classes across the city. And it's my understanding from the folks at the Pratt that they were able to have some really candid and meaningful conversations, even through this distance media that we're working in right now. And I think that what I've been hearing from city schools teachers is that the fact that the author this year is from Baltimore and is writing specifically about the neighborhoods that they, even if they don't know his neighborhood, they certainly are familiar, that has piqued a lot of interest for many of the young people. The previous 2 books were also compelling in different ways. The first, called Dear Martin, was letters. It's told through a series of letters that a young person is writing to Martin Luther King Jr. as a way of working through his own emotions around neighborhood violence and issues related to systemic racism. And then the second year book it's called The Long Way Down. And it is a series of poems describing the ramifications of a shooting and the potential for retaliation in a young man's life. And so each year, there've definitely been themes related to thinking through decision-making and consequences. And some of what we saw in the evaluation, which we shared last week, is that in the second year of the program, at least, students who read at least some of the book, if not all of it, reported wanting to have more conversations about those issues. And I think, as Dr. Stock so eloquently reflected earlier, one of the great powers of literature, and especially relevant literature and literature where people feel represented, is that it can prompt these kinds of conversations. And so I think it's exciting that books like this and authors like this are so willing to give back, especially to young people. Next week, we are going to be hearing from young people. We are going to be joined by a Baltimore City middle school teacher. His name is Wyatt Oroke, and he was actually named both Baltimore City and Maryland Teacher of the Year in 2020. He works with scholars at City Springs Middle School, which is located in East Baltimore. And he co-wrote a discussion guide around We Speak for Ourselves with D. Watkins. So Wyatt and some of his scholars will be joining us both to reflect upon the One Book process. And also it's my understanding that they will also be sharing some of their own work that they created in going through this process themselves as 7th and 8th graders this past year. We're also going to be joined by Dr. David Falcone, who is a public health researcher and also a master storyteller. And he does research looking at a lot of different topics, specifically in the African-American community, but also comes from a family heritage of storytelling and has in the past, I've been fortunate enough to hear him talk about the kind of power and impact of telling your own story. And we've certainly touched upon that tonight. So it'll be interesting to hear more about that from him next week. And also, I'm excited to hear the scholars reflect on what they hear from Dr. Falcone. So that's next week. I will send a follow-up email out after this meeting so that you all have the link to the Google form if you'd like to share some of your writing with us. And we just really appreciate your time tonight, and we will look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much. And thank you, Dr. Golden, Dr. Stocks, for your time. It's wonderful to see you both. Have a good night.